Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, it's going to be the first in a series on Depressive Personality Disorder. Now, this one has been looming for a while. This one's also particularly near and dear to my heart. It's also the first in my depression series, the first in my personality series that is not actually technically in the current Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, the DSM. And so, if you're familiar with my personality series, the first one is the key elements episode. Well, the key elements is a little bit tricky here because it's not technically in the DSM. So I'm going to be doing two things to try to kind of weave this together. One, I'm going to go back to the earlier versions of the DSM that did mention depressive personality disorder, and then also go through the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, which I frequently reference, but has really retained the heart and soul of depressive personality disorder. And, perhaps even start off with a quick commentary on the difference between what used to be called dysthymia. I missed that word, very beautiful word, and now it's called persistent depressive disorder. So let us begin with the difference between PDD, persistent depressive disorder, aka dysthymia, versus persistent depressive disorder. Persistent depressive personality. Sneak peek of what I'm getting into here is there's some overlap here. The similarities between PDD and depressive personality disorder. So, there's debate in the similarities or the overlap between a personality disorder versus PDD. And I think the reason for this debate is that in my personal opinion, there's some conflating. There's a lack. The constructs artificially separate them out, in my opinion. The easiest way to think of it is that PDD, persistent depressive disorder, aka dysthymia, has a much more dominant focus on mood, sort of. And with that, people kind of separate out and say, well, it's kind of your clinicalized. Perhaps there's some biology behind this sort of depressivity, whereas a personality disorder is more of like a characterological, cognitive object relations, kind of self and other understanding construct. And indeed, you can have a mix and a match of these, but I think it is unwise to assume that they are so distinct. Never mind, I don't find it terribly helpful to give somebody, to prospectively, I can't give them anymore technically, but it would be incredibly unhelpful, in my opinion, to suggest that someone has PDD and then also depressive personality disorder. To me, we're just talking about a lot of symptoms that can overlap with one another, and the degree to which, and the kind of depth in which someone experiences like the distortions, the thematic issues traditionally associated with a personality disorder are going to vary in somebody with PDD, just like someone with a depressive personality disorder may or may not have dominant mood components akin to PDD. So to me, it's all one and the same, because when you look at PDD, it talks about a chronicity and a lack of remission. We're talking like the technical guidelines are no more than like 2 months at a time without at least a low-grade hum of depression looming in the background. And when you talk about that persistence, as well as some ability for there to be fluctuations within that persistence, that mirrors and mimics what we see with personality disorders. There is a misunderstanding around personality disorders that once you have them, they're severe and they're persistent and they never change. Au contraire, the severity actually waxes and wanes over time. And so we're mincing meat here between a more dominant mood component versus a more dominant sort of object relations component. Whereas I'm saying, look, you're going to have a mixture and a match of all the above. To me, depressive personality disorders they very commonly have a major mood component that would qualify them for a PDD diagnosis on top of the major thematic issues that are commonly associated with the personality disorder. There are some people I meet that there is really just more of a mood, less kind of like object relationally marred component of their psyche that maybe would have me arguing more distinctly for PDD and never conceptualize it as a personality issue. But those to me are relatively rare And when I do see them, there's probably more of like a neurodevelopmental kind of component, a biological component that is driving their depression, and thereby you often see them being a little bit more responsive to medication. But again, this is because we study these based in like segmented constructs. Never mind, we dissolved one of the constructs, the depressive personality disorder, and so we don't study it as much anymore. I would bargain if there's a major mood component to a depressive personality disorder, it would be at least modestly responsive to medication, but the dominant object relation issue would remain. We see this identically with borderline personality disorder, that they are sometimes responsive to mood stabilizers and antidepressants, but it does not fundamentally address the core issue of the personality disorder. It just softens a lot of the symptoms. And when you start to really engage in personality disorder focused treatment with them, you will then see the rest of the mood improvements occur accordingly. So the easiest way is if there's such a thing in this human-made construct known as dysthymia or PDD that is magically independent of one's personality, which, remember, is a mixture of biology and environment, nature and nurture, they would be highly responsive to medication. And, very basic treatment gets them out of it. You just kind of help them with restructuring cognitions and stuff, and out they go, and they do very, very well. If there's a PDD out there that's separate from a personality disorder, that's what that would look like, in my opinion. if there's any sort of I hate the word, like resistance, quote unquote, resistance to treatment, or there's just this gradualness, and or they're on medication, it takes off an edge, but it doesn't solve the fundamental dilemma, you're talking about a personality disorder. I'm sorry. And then remember, on top of that the psychodynamic folks, myself included, believe in dimensional understandings of personality. That it's not you have it or you don't. There are more neurotic presentations. There are the kind of midline, quote unquote, borderline organization levels. And then there's the very poorly organized, aka psychotic levels of organization. And that's going to modify things all the same. And so even if you say, well, they're responsive to medication, they're responsive to short-term treatment, maybe it's a distinct category, or maybe, because of the chronicity and the depth and the breadth of the symptoms, we're talking about a more neurotically organized depressive personality disorder, because they tend to be more responsive to treatment. They tend to have less foundational issues that require longitudinal treatment to really get them on a healthier path. Now, all of this is semantics. I don't know how much anybody really cares about it, but I just think it's unwise to ignore. If there is a deep chronicity and something that just it's not, you can't like self-help book somebody out of it. To me, it is personally wise to consider that underlying personality, underlying object relations, underlying schemas, whatever you want to call them, could be a factor in their presentation. And that factor requires a different type of treatment than your just kind of traditional short-term outpatient and or medication. It's going to take a collaboration, and you're going to have to dig a little bit deeper into somebody's inner world to really get them on a better path. And we have to do a better job helping people understand the difference between these two, because our current field focuses on a medicalized understanding of depression. So it's quick, easy, surface level treatment often. And that's why you see folks with these very, deep, rich, quote unquote, I don't like the term treatment resistant, right? Forms of depression just cycling through treatment and not foundationally getting better. It's because we're not appreciating that there's a personality component to their presentation, or if we, heaven forbid, expand the definition of personality, a dominant personality issue is actually what we're talking about here, because they're allowed to have mood issues too. We unwisely didn't talk about mood issues in the past, I think, with depressive personality disorder, but it's a thing. It's absolutely a thing. All right. What was that? Oh gosh, that was 10 minutes of me ranting about that. Oh great. Now I need to get into the key components here. So I pulled up, actually don't have a DSM-3, very sad, and I don't know where my DSM-4 went. None of the 5s have depressive personality, so I had to pull up online. I think this is accurate because it's out of a research article. I'll read through the 7 components that were listed in the DSM-4 for depressive personality disorder, comment on them as I normally do, and then I'll look at the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual next and talk about that some. So, I remember personality disorder is all about persistence, pervasive. Remember, doesn't mean it doesn't ebb and flow. There can be variance here, but there is a persistence. This is not something that magically disappears for years at a time. And the key features here are: number one, the usual mood is dominated by dejection, gloominess, cheerlessness, joylessness, and unhappiness. Now, you'll notice there's still a mood component here. This is where, I kind of question the whole, well, PDD is so very different because there's a major mood component. Well, I don't know. Item 1 says there can be a lot of sadness. Now, notice that dejection is listed in this. A gloominess is included in this. And those are a little bit less medicalized terms, and they're really important because when we get into the psychodynamic understandings of depressive personality, dejection is a huge component. There's a relational component to some folks with depressive personality disorder. Again, it is a self separated from others, that there is something fundamentally wrong or not okay with them. And while that can cause a depressed mood and sadness, 100%, and or this sort of anhedonic, just kind of lack of, joy and finding enjoyment in things and a lack of motivation, there can also be, I'm dejected, something is broken about me, that there's something fundamentally wrong with me. And it's a really good sign, a good sign sounds like bad wording. It's an important sign, I think, of a depressive personality. And when I say object relations, it's a psychodynamic term, that's what I mean. Like, there is something fundamentally flawed in oneself, and very quickly you will see their worldview and the view of others shaped by this too. So that's number one. Number two, the self-concept centers around beliefs of inadequacy, worthlessness, and low self-esteem. Well, there you go. It's not just mood. There's something inadequate, worthless, or, I'm incapable. I just don't, I cannot fit, I cannot succeed, et cetera, et cetera. Those themes are very dominant. And to me, it's relatively self-explanatory. So 1, mood, 2, self-concept. This is where, my complaints, I love that they try to operationalize and spread out the symptom criteria, but as I frequently say in these personality disorder episodes, you will hear similarities between them, and because of that, you're going to very quickly meet criteria because they kind of play off each other. So if someone's has a very poor mood, sad, depressed, and dejected mood, on top of that, sees oneself as inadequate and worthless, it is not uncommon that number 3, they are critical, blaming, and self-derogatory. That now, again, that's not perfectly the same as 1 and 2, but they tend to see the world around them and experiences say, it must be my fault. There's something wrong with me, right? So it's gotta have to do with me, that I am somehow so ineffectual that I screwed that up, or I am unworthy in some sort of way. That anything that goes wrong, it's directed at the self. The psychodynamic people talk about it's like this aggressive tendency, but the knife is turned inward. It is turned towards the self. There's, it must be me. It's my fault. If you talk about like locus of control, these folks have such an internal locus of control. They have a very hard time looking outside themselves and saying, I don't know, maybe it's not you this time. It's really a really painful process for them, and it's just like, it's like trying to pull them out of a black hole because they just go there so very fast. It must be me. I must be broke. Something's wrong. Number 4, the person tends to brood and is given to worry. It's fun phrasing. It's like 1960s phrasing, it feels like. But, we see this in the psychodynamic literature too. There's this sort of, not gloominess, but there's this sort of wallowing nature to them. Now, the worry piece is always interesting to me because, to me, depression and anxiety absolutely can go hand in hand. And worry is kind of a manifestation of when the self, instead of looking at oneself and being so sad and depleted about the self, the minute you look outside of yourself, if you're deficient, anxiety should exist because it's like, how is this deficient self going to adequately engage this incredibly complex an incredibly demanding world? Well, the answer with depressive personality disorder is like, I'm going to suck. This is going to go very poorly. and I'm going to be very anxious, and they tend to avoid quite a bit because of that. There's a lot of avoidance behaviors. That's where like anxious components of personality come into play. So I like that that is listed on there, but there is this sort of broodiness, right? It's just there's always some sort of depressive energy about them. They're just kind of stewing in a pot of depression more times than not, which is why that dysthymic PDD presentation makes a lot of sense to me, because they talk about there's just this low hum. They might not be chronically, acutely depressed in front of your face, but there is just this like heaviness, this like cloud that follows them around. And uncoincidentally, in my opinion, Depressive Personality Disorder talked about that. Number 5 here, the person is negativistic, critical, judgmental towards others. Now, this one's important to kind of separate out because you'll notice this is actually kind of a little bit more directed outward. And the psychodynamic people talk a little bit about how this, in my opinion, I know I was not in these rooms, so there's people far smarter, far more qualified than I that can tell you the history of why and how these things have shifted over time. But this one is really interesting because there's a little bit of aggression projected outward in this item, and you will not see this in a lot of folks with depressive personality disorder because they are very hesitant to do that. But every once in a while, there is this sort of, I always see it as like a potential self-protective force that goes, you know what, I might be bad, but other people can't quite measure up either. I wonder if this item also causes some confusion because you will see this a little bit, or not a little bit, you'll see this a lot of it in sort of more injured narcissism, because there's a heavy devaluing of other people while simultaneously kind of wallowing in one's like, oh, I'm so bad, but I'm better than other people. Again, that's not what this item is technically going for, but it's easy to find a little bit of overlap. And once again, psychodynamic folks talk about this sort of bend towards negativism, this bend towards a more externalizing form of depression. My personal understanding of it is these folks begin their life so depleted, and that depletion is reinforced. Eventually it becomes intolerable, and it begins to be projected outward. But that is not, in my experience, it's not a dominant factor in the majority of the cases of depressive personality disorder that I think I see. So that one's a real interesting one. Negativistic, critical, and judgmental towards others. Number 6 is the person is pessimistic. Yeah. The psychodynamic, and Theodore Milan talk about like this, oh gosh, come on. Where's the word? Fatalism, right? It doesn't matter. Nothing's ever going to get any better. Just the future does not hold much promise for these folks. And so pessimism is always there, right? In treatment, you talk to them and say, well, what if you try it this way? And they're like, nope, it's not going to work anyway. Or they'll feign like, yeah, maybe. But what sabotages the treatment in between sessions is like they're not actually inclined to believe. They don't have that efficacy. They don't have that placebo effect of like, this time might be different. Oh, no. And the really tough cases, as my book closes itself, to me, the really tough cases are the ones that are depressed for such a long period of time. This pessimism, this fatalism, they're deeply entrenched in it. And they look back to these 7, 10, 20 years and say, well, I've tried and it never got any better. And then they can throw the baby out with the bathwater like clockwork. Now, this is treading into a subtype. This is treading into kind of a masochistic mentality, but I digress. I'll probably leave that. Yeah, I need to leave that for the subtypes episode. So just to review them again, dominant, dejected, unhappy, joyless mood, self-concepted, marred, inadequate, worthless. They are critical, blaming, and derogatory towards the self. That's number 3, in contrast with number 5. Number 5, negativistic, critical, and judgmental towards others. That's the one I said is a little bit rare. Number 4, tend to brood and is given to worry. Is pessimistic, number 6, and number 7, the person is prone to feeling guilty or remorseful. I would add shame to this list, personally. It's just like, and I think it builds off that critical self-blaming nature of like, it must be me, then I've done something wrong, and thereby I'm very guilty, and I'm so remorseful. Now, one of the challenges with this dynamic is this often solicits a nurturing response from other people, which unfortunately gets in the way of healthy conflict, right? Like the self requires conflict. I always say to folks, including myself, with depressive personalities, it's like there's a kernel of truth to your depression. There is probably some sort of dilemma, something that you're not doing quite as well, and you have to confront that dilemma. But a depressive kind of wallowing nature says like, oh, I'm just, I'm such a big screw up. And everybody goes, oh, now I can't confront you, right? I can't lean in and say, yes, that is an issue. It's not as bad as you think it is, right? Your depressive part of you is over inclined to overestimate how bad and ineffectual you are and or can be. But in doing so, in effect, they never actually confront the central dilemma that there could be indeed something that's not quite right that they need to work on. But this sort of wallowing, guilt-prone nature, just like, it's hard because you don't want to step on them, right? You don't want to kick them while they're down, quote unquote. And so, in effect, it keeps the drama alive. It perpetuates the depressive personality, and so it's a really important relational diagnostic item because it's very hard to encounter them because they are so remorseful and guilt-prone. That's at least my personal belief. So those are the 7 in the old DSM. Now, the PDM, the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, does offer a lot of similar sentiments. But I really like what they offer because they also go into some subtypes that I find to be incredibly useful. And they themselves talk about like, well, the overlap between these two, it's pretty similar. And maybe, I think they say per se, you can differentiate between it and a mood disorder. But there's quite a bit of overlap. So I'll just kind of read this out. They don't go in list form. They kind of do a narrative form here in the PDM. But they say it's one of the most common personality syndromes encountered. I would absolutely believe that. I'm gonna say this weird. It's a very accessible diagnosis because depression is to me a very human experience. We've made it into a clinical term, but the propensity or capacity for depression or seeing oneself critically is a nature of being human to a certain degree. And so I think it's easier to tread into this domain, especially when we talk about there being varying degrees of severity to a personality presentation. I think there are a ton of people with neurotically organized personalities that are prone towards depressivity, and thereby you see it quite a bit. Now, again, those neurotic folks, they tend to be highly responsive to treatment. You don't need to do a ton of work, but you are kind of fighting against this notion that has been lurking beneath the surface for quite a long time, that there's something fundamentally wrong with me. Anyway, so they often find little pleasure in life's activities and are chronically vulnerable to painful affect, especially depression. That was item 1 in the DSM. Guilt, that was item 7 in the DSM. Shame, which is the one I added. And feelings of inadequacy, which was item number 2 in the DSM. And I think the emphasis is there's a vulnerability to it. There's a lack of resiliency around this. There's a sensitivity. Their self is always looking out for the prospect of risk. Even neurotically organized folks are always looking out for kind of DSM talked about. Maybe it's me. Maybe there's something wrong. And so when a mood floats in, a depressive mood, or when the potential that I've done wrong or hurt somebody floats in, it's right there waiting for a minute, and it grabs hold. And again, there's often kernels of truth to those feelings, but a depressive personality, it's like jet fuel for it, right? You're just throwing fuel right on that fire, and boom, it flames up pretty quickly. To varying degrees, obviously, depending on organization level. They often appear conflicted about experiencing pleasure. In my own life, I often talk about there's this guilt of when I have free time, I'm always looking for free time. But the minute I have the potential to just experience pleasure for pleasure's sake, it feels selfish, it feels self-serving, or I should be doing more. Right? I'm wasting my time. How dare I just slow down? And it's because I have to like be present with myself and nurture myself, which is just not in my psyche. My psyche is like, I probably need to be punished somehow. I need to, not have too much enjoyment. And again, relationally, it creates pickles to be in relationships with people like myself, because it's just like this self-punitive, endless loop that makes it very hard for needs to get met. They appear to squelch or inhibit positive feelings such as joy, excitement, and pride. Now, I will note that there's an interesting cultural component. I mean, I think it's very important to note that there is this sort of squelching. Like, it doesn't feel appropriate. It doesn't feel right. It feels almost like, in how dare I be so, open with positive feelings. But I think there are cultural components to this too. Like, for instance, this sort of item, when you think about gender socialization, and particularly men, that is kind of ingrained in quite a bit of gender socialization. So you have to be kind of careful of that. Never mind, say, like a less expressive culture across the globe might look a little bit more depressive, because there is the sort of emphasis on containment of emotion. So just kind of note. But the underlying vibe is like, I'm just not worth that positive sentiment. It's uncomfortable for me to experience positive sentiments. Not like I've been trained and I'm not supposed to, but like I can't. I literally I can't. They say they might be highly self-critical and self-punitive, holding themselves to unrealistic standards and blaming themselves when things go wrong. Again, the DSM version of this kind of did an okay job on that. They might fear rejection or abandonment, feel alone even in the presence of others. That one's a really important one. You will see that depressive personality disorders are often loners, and it just worsens their experience 100%, right? Like, I'm a relational psychodynamic person. We often heal ourselves by virtue of having relationships with other people. But it would be unwise to assume that depressive personality disorder folks have to be loners. These are folks that can indeed interact and be connecting, quote unquote, with other people, but still feel chronically alone. That there's like a facade to those, or there's, quite often they struggle actually with deeper levels of intimacy. They can play that kind of front level, I don't want to say game, but they, that sort of front level, surface level associating with one another, but that going deeper just is inaccessible, because again, something about me is fundamentally flawed. I'm going to screw this up. I'm not worth it, etc., etc. So just kind of note, they don't have to be loners. And they have a pervasive sense that someone or something necessary for their well-being has been lost to them forever. This is, the beauty of psychodynamic thought is there's some art, there's some poetry to it, and as woo-woo, I suppose some people use that term, or as touchy-feely, or as abstract as that concept is, I think it's really important. I find metaphor and imagery to be vital to the world of psychology, of more deeply understanding folks. And depressive personality disorders often say, like, the void is right there waiting for them. There is something that will suck them in, and will be lost to them forever. Now, the challenge is nothing's ever lost forever, because if it was just that simple, that was lost forever, why would someone be chronically suffering? Well, it's always this struggle. It's always this kind of tug of war. Something is being sucked in by the void. It never fully happens, because life just doesn't operate that way. But it's a sense of like, I will lose. Now, note, it does say I will lose relationships too. I will find myself alone because people will be taken from me. But this is kind of treading towards subtypes. Some of them, it's just like, I will lose myself because I'm just not worth it. I'm barely here as is. I'm holding a candle in the dark here, barely existing. I will never have successful relationships, and those that I do obtain will be lost to me, and I will be alone and dejected once again. But we'll get towards subtypes. Depression, self-criticism, or self-punitiveness is often defended against an awareness of underlying aggression. So, one of the things us psychodynamic people, I don't think it's just us, talk about is like, aggression is a part of all human existence. And you see this within more internalizing type personalities, especially dependent personality disorder, where aggression is disavowed. Aggression exists, and this is, I think, where we went to, what was it, item 6? No, item 5 on the DSM, is that it's not uncommon for depressive individuals to eventually have that aggression come out and be like, you know what, no. Other people are incapable, unworthy, they're not giving me my fair shake, and you'll hear this and see this come up. And the nature of it, if you go back to like early childhood, is essentially, again, a self-preserving force. I am bad or good, the world is bad or good, and we learn to entertain the grays ideally as we get older and more wise and have more experience, and our self states kind of talk to each other more evenly and more fairly. But a depressive personality is so much in the camp of I'm a piece of crap. They will periodically have these little fires of just like, no, the world sucks and I hate the world and the world's bad and people mistreat me and but then it's, oh no, I can't do that, right? And they will disavow it very, very quickly. A little bit of a sneak peek going into treatment. Importantly, though, that is a self-preserving force. You just need it to manifest in a healthier, less absolute way, because you're getting this heavy absolute in the depressive, depleted void, and then very sudden and only momentary shifts into the world sucks. So you want to capitalize on that world sucks energy part way through before it gets to the world and other people suck, because that's too absolute. It will just refuel guilt and worthlessness and I'm a jerk and all these other things. But there is a helpful energy to that. And I think it's cool, both the DSM and the psychodynamic folks, the PDM, both appreciate that there can be this externalizing aggression somewhere in there. It's just depressive personalities, much like anxious personalities, much like dependent personalities, just cannot stay there for very long. Last but not least, I'll kind of go into the key features that they do list. These are, I think, very useful. I have always found them useful. I can skip that one. I always say, like, hey, there can be genetic components to this, but there can also be heavy environmental components to this. This is why those notions of like, well, PDD is separate, It's like, well, no, you're looking at dimensionality here. Like the heavily genetic ones usually will have very heavy mood components. And again, they might be a little bit more responsive to medication and stuff like that, but I digress. It's the central tension of preoccupation is self-criticism and self-punitiveness, a preoccupation with relatedness and loss, or both, right? I am bad, I'm going to criticize myself, and or I'm going to lose, I'm going to be alone in this world, and or both. Central affects are sadness, guilt, and shame. Once again, the sadness is there. The guilt is there, but I think that shame component is really important, because there is this just like this unworthiness behind shame. It's, to me, guilt is an appropriate emotion. Brene Brown talks about this, but when it transcends into this heavy oppressive shame, that shame does have its place in society, but they fire on shame cylinders all the time. That's not a healthy car, if I'm going with the cylinders, firing on cylinders metaphor there. The one that I think is really powerful to say out loud is the characteristic pathogenic belief about self. There is something essentially bad or inadequate about me. Something essentially inadequate. And it's right, it's at that core. Right? You don't need to do deep schema work to be like, oh, guess what's going to be in there if they've got a depressive personality disorder. There's something fundamentally wrong with me. And that will be discovered. I already know it, and I'm very afraid other people will discover it. And then, again, the ones that are a little bit more relationally driven, someone or something necessary for well-being has been irretrievably lost. I will lose everything. And the characteristic pathogenic belief about others is what I've already went into. People who get to know me, the real me, I like to add, will reject me. And I say the real me because people will, when I meet with depressive personalities and I think about my own journey in it, they will often say, like, they will dismiss that they do have some okay relationships in their life because they're like, well, they don't know the real me. And there's a kernel of truth in that, because they don't show their entire selves because they're terrified to do so. But in doing so, they prevent themselves from ever being actually litmus testing whether or not they're an acceptable human being. So people who get to know me, the real me, will reject me. ultimately, at the end of the day, rejection is waiting. I've already rejected myself in a lot of ways, is often the case. But there is this fear and this belief of like, other people won't like me either. Or if they do, they'll eventually see the real me. They'll see the real pattern. The other belief often is like, I'm so depressed and I'm so kind of down all the time, people don't really want to be around that. And there's a kernel of truth to that. There's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're Debbie Downer, the SNL skit all the time, yeah, you can play into the rejection that you fear so much. And this is, kind of getting into the treatment that this work is tough because depression in many ways, these depressive ways of looking at self and others are not totally wrong. They have kernels of truth. And to confront those without injuring the person with the depressive personality so much that they wallow and then they refuse to take risks is very challenging. It's very challenging, and that's how the cycle perpetuates itself. So, and talk about defenses: introjection, reversal, idealization of others, devaluation of self, ways in which essentially they keep ironically, like usually unconsciously, they're keeping that depressive process going. So, all right, that is probably where I need to end. I mean, it's probably a little bit of a longer episode, a little bit more disjointed because, again, it's been taken out of the DSM. So hopefully that's helpful. I talked a little bit, just to recap, I talked a little bit about the alleged differences between a PDD, dysthymic, clinicalized version of depression versus depressive personality disorder. My notion is that we're talking about two constructs that often play together but might periodically be more one than the other, but that's based on a very categorical understanding of personality disorder, in my opinion. So to me, they're more related than not. But there are treatment implications, so it's good to kind of understand the pushes and pulls between biology and environments, object relations and self versus mood components. Sure. Number two, went through the old DSM of what it posited depressive personality disorder is. A lot of them are good items, 7 of them that we went through, and then we rounded things out by going through the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, which hopefully added some color shading and depth to an already reasonably solid, I felt, list given to us by the old DSM. So, as always, I'm going to have future episodes. I've already alluded there's going to be subtypes. The subtypes episode might be a big one because there are a lot of layers to the subtypes here. On the depressive side, I think that's pretty common because it's such a widespread phenomenon. When something is so intrinsically human, you're going to see it crop up in different ways. And masochism is going to be on that list. I've thought, should I separate that out and do a whole other series? We'll see if the subtype episode is worth it. We'll also talk about developments, but that one's, I think, a pretty quick one. So I might fold some of those in, treatment, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll kind of go through some of those and see how many episodes I got. But as always, I hope it's interesting. I hope it's helpful, particularly given that this one you have to kind of search the web and search history for. So stay tuned. I hope you look at the other episodes when I get to them and release them. And as always, stay curious.